So, welcome to the latest video in my Writers in Conversation series. Today I'm joined by Christina Rosso, author of She is a Beast, and we're going to be talking about our latest books, Feminism within Fairy Tales and Writing Feminist Stories. Firstly, as with all of these videos, this is a live broadcast, so if you're watching live, you can use the live chat facility to ask us questions, and we can answer them right now. And I'm just so excited to be having this conversation because I love fairy tales so much. And Christina, your book is just amazing. Like, I interviewed you not long ago for Book Party Chat on Twitter, and I had such a great time talking to you, especially about the inspiration behind She is a Beast. So do you want to start by introducing viewers to you and your work?
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Madeline. So, like she said, I'm the author of She is a Beast. This book was just released on May 2nd from APEP Publications, and it is a collection of feminist fairy tales. Some of them are reimaginings of the stories that we know and love, like Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella, and then some of them are very much inspired by the world of fairy tales, but aren't necessarily grounded in one specific one. There's 6 stories in the collection, and in each one, it follows a different female character who is fighting to survive in the world that she exists in, which is very much grounded in the patriarchy, and is trying to find some form of liberation from it. I have Madeline with me, and I would love for you to talk about your fairy tale, The Curse of the Winged WIGHT.
Yeah, so this is my book here. I keep forgetting what the camera is when I'm holding something.
I know.
The Curse of the Winged WIGHT is a fairy tale, and it's young adults. The main character is a 16-year-old called Rosanna, and she's an apprentice dressmaker for the Dark Witch. And basically, it's about how Rosanna's been plagued for years by an evil fairy who possesses her, and she also sees these ghostly apparitions of long ago murdered girls. So the story follows her as she learns of a curse, and it's the Curse of the Winged WIGHT, hence the title. And she has to find a way to break this curse, else she'll die. And it's a really dark and gritty story, and it's very much inspired by Charles Perrault's The Sleeping Beauty, which was written in 1697. And it's got like female ogres, it's got ghosts, evil fairies, and witches, and I just really loved writing it. This is my first fairy tale, but I am working on another one in my spare time, which is sort of like a sequel to this one. My fairy tales are very much inspired by traditional, like the old fairy tales, like the ones that were written several hundred years ago, way before Disney. Sleeping Beauty, which is sort of like the source material that inspired The Curse of the Winged WIGHT, is one of my favourites. But I also really like fairy tales that blend another genre or form. So when I was at university, I came across Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. And that's just this amazing Victorian fairy tale about greed and also the female body and female hunger. And it's also got the power of like sisterly love and redemption, and the whole thing is just written in this poem form, and I just love that because it's just like so rich and amazing to read. So that's definitely like one of my favorite fairy tales. So Christina, what would you say your favorite fairy tale is?
So my current favorite fairy tale, because I feel like it changes. I'm just like you. I love reading the old, like several hundred-year-old European folklore and folk tales, very different than the versions we see in Disney. And so a lot of my work starts by studying the earliest English written versions of these tales. So the one that I'm currently really focused on is Bluebeard, which Charles Perrault has a version of. And I think I like this story so much because, one, I'm fascinated by serial killers and true crime, and Bluebeard may have been inspired by a real-life serial killer. But also I love that even though it is a story that's about violence towards women, the current wife always finds a way to survive. I haven't ever seen a version where he actually successfully murders her. And so, one, I think that's so different from from what we see in a lot of fairy tales, because she is victorious, and she's victorious usually either by her own wits, which I love, or she gets help from either family or she makes a friend. And so I like that because it's seeing her taking some kind of role in saving herself. So that's the fairy tale that I'm currently the most, I don't know, fascinated with. I'm in the process of writing a collection that is completely inspired by that, where each story follows a different wife of Bluebeard, and in the end they come together to defeat him, for once and for all, both as ghosts and alive. So that'll hopefully come out sometime in the future when I finish it. Yeah. So how do you think fairy tales are relevant today?
Yes, I think fairy tales will always be relevant, sort of no matter what the time is. So I'd say it's just because they have this magical quality that does seem sort of like immune to aging. Like they're always about such important messages, and so they'll always be relevant. Like that's my view, particularly when a lot look at moral issues and ethics. And all the feminist fairy tales are just so important all the time because, like you say, it's about like showing that women, like can have their own agency to like save themselves, and I just think that is so important. And of course you have got like all different types of fairy tales too, so I know we've mainly been talking about sort of like fairy tales aimed at adults, but children's fairy tales have become like this whole new genre, and these are much softer, kinder versions of the adult ones in many cases. Like they don't have like all the poisonings and the deaths and the violence. And I think children's fairy tales are also really important and relevant because they allow children to discover the world and engage in this sense of magic and mystery. But they're also about moral lessons and teaching. And they do make these moral lessons quite fun and vivid, so children are more likely to remember them because they're having fun. Like they can see themselves in these characters, the princesses and the princes. And you've got all these mystical beings too, so they're great for like imaginative play. But I do know that there is this, there's currently a divide about whether fairy tales are helpful, particularly for children. So I recently read an article where Adele just says fairy tales teach us about life, which is definitely something that I agree with. But Ross Clark was saying that they're not sort of like, they shouldn't be encouraged as much, because he was saying that fairy tales are about scaring us into conforming, and that's often the purpose of the children's fairy tales. Because like they're basically sort of like used to keep children in their place and keep them from like speaking out or like going against what society wants, basically. And yeah, so what do you think about that? Because there's those two very different views.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely believe that fairy tales are a reflection of society, of its standards, of its designated roles, of its morals, and I think in terms of adult fairy tales, that they're especially relevant today because of women's rights and where we are in this moment. Women are typically in fairy tales put into what I call boxes. So, there's the young, beautiful, virginal, maiden, or there's the older, ugly, evil, older woman or crone, and typically these two types of women don't they're pitted against each other, right? Like there isn't this sense of community between women often in fairy tales, and there isn't usually the chance for not even just female identifying characters, but any characters that are deemed as other in some capacity who don't fit into these boxes, to be real, like layered human beings and creatures. So I think they're really relevant for that reason, because you can never, like, there's never too many versions of a fairy tale. I feel like you can continue to unpack it based off of the time you are in history and see how that reflects that. In terms of what you were talking about with children, and the idea of like it's scaring children into submission or into certain roles, I don't know if fairy tales that are being written today are doing that as much as they were, in the 16 and 17 and 1800s. When you look at, for instance, like the Brothers Grimm, they wrote many versions of the same fairy tales, and it depended on what their purpose was, who they were writing for. If they were writing for children, they very much had that moral component to it, right? They're trying to teach you a lesson. They're trying to scare you about something. But if they're writing for, a court, it looks different. So I write adult fairy tales, but I don't see a ton that's being written contemporary that is, trying to scare children. But I also think it's honestly better to have these grittier, scarier tales be available for children instead of, the Disney-ified, happily ever after heteronormative versions, because I think that's honestly worse for kids, because then they're growing up with expectations of a prince saving them, and, everything's going to be perfect and simple and one-dimensional, which isn't life.
Yeah, definitely.
So I don't know.
Yeah. Like what you were saying about how often you don't have sort of like a lot of female characters working together in a sense of community in fairy tales is something that like does interest me quite a lot. And I know when I was writing The Castle of Winged White, that was one thing that I really sort of wanted to explore in my fairy tale. So you've got like this whole community of women, but you've got like humans, you've got the female ogre, you've got a witch, you've got fairies, like all coming together, and they're all like prominent main characters. And I do really like exploring like a sense of female community and female power when women work together and sort of like take on sort of patriarchy between them. So,
yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue, but that collection of feminist fairy tales does exactly that, which I love. And I can't wait to read your book, by the way. But, having women, teaching women and trying to help women is so amazing to see in general, but especially in a genre where we don't often see that.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really like Goblin Market as well, because you've got like the two main characters are like the two sisters, and like although sort of like one of them, I don't know, have you read it?
I have it. I put it on my notes of something.
Okay, so you've got like these two sisters in it, and one of them becomes tempted by like this food at a market that's offered to her, and like basically it's sort of like all about how like greed can like destroy you, and it's like you've got one of the sisters then being force-fed loads of food. But the fairy tale does like end with the two sisters coming together, and when they unite, they are able to sort of like overthrow all the villains. And that's one of the reasons I really like that, because it's just so feminist, and it really sort of really shows how women working together can be so powerful and so effective. And like I did read that when I was doing sort of like Victorian studies at University for English, and it was just really powerful for me to read like this Victorian text with such a strong message about like female solidarity and like women working together and sisterly love being like this overarching theme in that fairy tale.
Yeah, I love that. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, what writers have inspired you then?
So, I mean, a huge influence for me is Angela Carter and her collection, The Bloody Chamber, which was published in 1979. And as I've been starting to talk about my book and promoting my book, whenever someone's asked me about my inspiration, I essentially say, this book would not exist without that book. I found or discovered The Bloody Chamber when I was doing my master's in English, and it just kind of opened this whole world to me. I'd always loved fairy tales. I had always loved folklore. I was already writing feminist fiction, but I didn't know that feminist fairy tales was a thing. And so I read The Bloody Chamber. I did an independent study on it. I ended up doing my thesis on the Earl King, which is a really interesting Scandinavian folktale. And from there, I just saw how Angela Carter not only was writing fresh feminist versions of these tales, but she was also going as far back, and she also spoke many languages. So she was translating them from their original written languages into English, and then was writing her own. And I was like, this is amazing. So I started to do that same thing myself, though taking the earliest English versions, because I'm not particularly great at foreign languages. I'm working on it. And so everything she does, the way she explores violence and sexuality and identity in that collection has been so inspirational to me. And then some writers who are working in the fairy tale genre, who are currently still alive and writing, that I find a lot of inspiration from. Emma Donoghue, who I mentioned, her collection Kissing the Witch. Mallory Daniel Ortberg, who wrote The Merry Spinster. And I also really enjoy Nikita Gill's work. So Fierce Fairy Tales, I often teach that in a Reimagining Fairy Tales workshop that I teach. And I just ordered her book, Great Goddesses, so I'm excited to dive into that. What about you? What writers inspire you?
Yeah, so like I've only sort of like, I'm quite new to writing fairy tales, so in terms of like writers that really inspire me like in the fairy tale genre, I have to say like, well, again, like Christina Rossetti, the author of Goblin Market, but also like the Brothers Grimm, because like their collections I just get so much inspiration from, especially when I'm like trying to sort of work out which sort of fairy tale I want to retell in the story. And like I just love analysing their works, particularly the lesser known fairy tales. So I have been I was reading one this morning actually. It's The Water of Life, and I just really love that story. And I love how like there's so many different messages and sort of perspectives that are in all of their fairy tales really. And it's just so rich and there's just so much that you can unpack. And yeah, I really like analysing them. And yeah, I have a collection of them paperback, collection on my Kindle. And I do just like sort of like dipping into their work, like wherever I am really, because like it's quite nice that they're quite short as well, so you don't need like a great deal of time to read them. And I just always find something new, even if I'm rereading one that I think I know quite well. I'll just like take something new from it each time. So yeah, which fairy tales do you find yourself coming back to again and again?
So I mentioned that I'm currently really inspired by Bluebeard, and then I'm already working on a collection about that. And it was not my original plan to write a collection all about Bluebeard, but every time I was taking a writing class or would just sit down to do some writing, I just kept writing a new story for it. And so that's definitely one that I'm right now or for like the last year have continued to come back to. But then some other fairy tales that are just stuck with me and that I continue to reimagine, and there are some versions of them in my book, She is a Beast, are Beauty and the Beast and Sleeping Beauty. Beauty and the Beast growing up was my absolute favorite story. I knew one good thing about Disney, I guess I'll say, is that I loved the 1991 animated movie. Growing up, I knew every single word to the dialogue, to the songs. I loved a character who was smart and read a lot because I did that. And also liked that she didn't quite fit in. I don't necessarily, buy into the whole romance in it, but I really loved that as a kid. And then as I've gotten older and started researching fairy tales, a lot of my work has come back to Beauty and the Beast, because I'm interested, and you can probably guess this from the title of my book, She is a Beast, that I explore the wildness that we can possess, especially as women. And so it was a lot of fun in my book to explore Beauty and the Beast in the first story, Killing the Beast, where you can guess from the title that my Belle character, my Beauty character, ends up literally murdering the Beast. And that was important for me too to write, because it's so different than everything you ever see about that. And it's not about romance, and there's no Stockholm syndrome. And she starts off as a prisoner, but she is not a victim. And I just have so much fun continually coming back to that fairy tale and seeing different ways to interpret it. And then another fairy tale that I keep writing different variations of is Sleeping Beauty. And I think that in part is that I'm really interested in exploring the idea of specifically fairy tales where female characters are voiceless or like literally unconscious. So we have Sleeping Beauty, we have Snow White. what does that mean to be this woman who literally has no choice in her circumstances? And so in my book, She is a Beast, I have a story called Faux Fairy Tale, where this character does not want to be woken up. She does not want the prince to kiss her. And I've been playing around with a lot of different versions of that, where this character either wants to just be left alone, or she's like, we're not going to have a happily ever after. The thing society has told you is wrong. But also starting to give these characters that are literally asleep, and voiceless, the chance to tell their story. And in the last couple of years, I've also been doing research about Sleeping Beauty, and how when you look at its earliest versions, it starts very violent. There's an ogre who eats children. There's sexual assault. And so I have a paper that I'm still in the process of writing. We'll see if I ever finish it. But where you can literally trace from one version to the next of Sleeping Beauty, how the violence was slowly sucked out of it. And my argument is that actually has hurt society and the people who are reading this, because you get down to the version we see with Disney, and the prince doesn't even have to touch her, right? Like, she just wakes up because he's in the space, right? So you start with the prince sexually assaulting her and impregnating her, right? And then you go all the way down the line to where he doesn't even touch her. And obviously, I don't want any person to ever be violated. But that's not teaching a lesson, right? We talked about lessons earlier about what the real world looks like and what consent looks like. So I find myself wanting to really explore that idea, especially since in the last few years, with the Me Too movement really taking off. I have been thinking about this a lot, of survivors telling their story, and how society for a long time, and even many aspects of it now, don't want people who have been assaulted or who have experienced trauma to share their stories. And I think if we just erase it from stories, and give this perfect idea of like, she just wakes up because she's supposed to, and everything's going to be happily ever after, that's just doing us a disservice, because then it's making it harder for us to talk about these issues that are very real.
Exactly, and those are sort of things that we do need to be talking about publicly a lot more. So yeah, like, I know, having read your collection, that your fairy tales are so feminist, and like, that's one of the things I really loved about your collection as well. I know also your collection is illustrated. So did you just want to like hold it up to the camera so we can see like?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So it was illustrated by my publisher, and it's published by APEP. I'll just flip through so you can see. I keep forgetting where the camera is.
Yeah, all the time.
But there's individual illustrations for all of the stories. And it was such an incredible process to work on this and then see it come to life. So it's really beautiful. And I'm so excited about it, like how it turned out.
Yeah, like I remember when I first started, when I first came across your book and I got my copy, I didn't actually realize at first it was going to be illustrated, but it just adds this whole extra dimension to the whole reading experience, and it just makes it so much richer, I think, like so much more rich than, and like the images and like the illustrations do really play into your own like imagery, and I just think it just adds a whole new layer to it. And yeah, I keep recommending your book to like all my friends who are interested in feminism and fairy tale, because like it's just like a neat collection.
Thank you.
Yeah, so shall we talk a bit about feminism specifically within fairy tales, like a bit more? I know we have like talked about that quite a lot already, but yeah, so how would you define a feminist fairy tale?
Yeah, so I feel like this term gets thrown around a lot, and people are like, I don't exactly know what that is. But essentially, a feminist fairy tale examines and unpacks the politics of gender, sexuality, and identity. And often it is done through the lens of having a character that's typically oppressed have agency or actually, gain a voice and be able to tell the story. Yeah. I feel like that's like the simplest explanation of what it is.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, with my own book, I do think of this as a feminist fairy tale too. Like traditionally, you've got very strict gender roles in fairy tales, um, and in writing the classical winged white, I really wanted to subvert these gender norms. So all my main characters are female. Like you've got the protagonist, who's a human. You've got the dressmaker. Well, she is the dressmaker of the Dark Witch. But then you've got like the other people involved in dressmaking. They're all female as well. Then you've got evil fairies, the Dark Witch herself, a female ogre, and the one sort of male character who is in my story. He's like the prince figure, but and like although he is the love interest of the main character and like he's set up that way, it's not a love story, and he's quite a soft character. Like he's not sort of like stereotypically masculine in his characteristics, and he doesn't save the day. Like it's left to the women to save the day. And my story also looks at disability because the mother of the main character uses a wheelchair due to a spinal injury, and she is one of the characters who is involved in the rescue sort of like at the end of the story. So I was really interested in writing it, in examining gender and disability in my book in sort of like this feminist way, because like I think it is just really important to sort of show like that anyone can sort of like be this really sort of like important character who does bring about change. And I think we really need to sort of show more sort of like women being empowered. So yeah, for you, how do the politics of gender and sexuality tie into fairy tales?
So I think that gender and sexuality and identity are so deeply rooted in fairy tales. I talked a little bit earlier about like these boxes that I always think of when it comes to fairy tales, and they exist for all characters within the world, not just, you know, female bodied or female identifying characters. You know, men are typically like a prince, right? Or a king. And if they're a prince, they're like usually very handsome, but they're also dumb. You know, and then there's, you know, an evil sorcerer. You know, there's these very one-dimensional essentially like roles or opportunities created for these characters in fairy tales. So I think that it's important to unpack that from whatever angle feels most interesting to you or most authentic to you. And so that's why I, with my writing and with my book, She's the Beast, I really focus from a female perspective. All of the stories follow the perspective of a female identifying character. There are a few male characters, but they are definitely not in control of the situation. They may think that they are, and you know, in certain cases, it ends pretty badly for them. I definitely, something that I love to explore, especially in the fairy tale realm, is violence towards men who deserve it. You know, I don't condone in real life violence towards any people, but you know, I have a man-eating siren in my collection, and that's really fun to explore, a character who the patriarchy has destroyed. I mean, she was literally murdered by her own father because she got pregnant out of wedlock, and so now she eats men. Until she can eat her father, you know, and have her revenge. And obviously that is a very extreme reaction, but also transforming into this monstrous creature is also an extreme reaction and a magical reaction, and something that can happen in fairy tales. So it's something like a character like that is really fun to play with, to look at how her identity changes from being this young, beautiful maiden type character, right, who has limited options. She's likely to be married off to someone, right? She gets traded from her father to her husband, right? One man to the next. But then she gets pregnant, and that, you know, puts a bump in her journey, right? So then she ends up being murdered and transforms into this other creature. So then what does that do for her identity? And then how does she adapt to that? So I like to, in my work and specifically in this book, look at how these characters are dealing with their circumstances and doing whatever they can to adapt to survive. And a lot of that is deeply rooted in the fact that they are women, that they are seen as less than in this society, that they are seen as others. And so I think, one, it's really interesting to explore, but it also reflects reality. As a woman, I'm treated a different way by society. I never planned, for instance, to get married. I met my husband and we decided, that we wanted to do that. But we, for instance, don't plan on having children. But people don't even ask if we're going to have children. It's just an assumption of when it's going to happen, right? And so it's things like that happen, in 2020, to someone who literally, like, I might as well just walk around with, like, I am a feminist shirt on because it's in everything that I do. And people still try to put me into a box. And so then you think about these stories that are rooted, starting in the 1300s, for instance. Like, of course, the patriarchy was very strong then. And these boxes, there were so many less boxes or options for women at that time. So it's something that I think is extremely relevant in fairy tales, and important to unpack, whether you're just reading older tales and analyzing them, or whether you're sitting down to write reimagined feminist fairy tales.
Yeah, definitely. Like what you were saying sort of about the female body as well, and like the transformation, like especially how it ties into violence and like violent acts at the hand of man and woman, and how that then like physically changes her body. That's something that I'm really interested in. And like in my next fairy tale, like although I'm sort of like I've been looking loosely at the Brothers Grimm's collection, sort of like inspiration, and I am really interested in like illness and disability because I'm a disabled writer myself. So I'm sort of like really interested in examining the female body more, and especially sort of like the chronically ill and disabled female body. And yeah, the fairy tale that I was actually just reading today, The Water of Life, that's got like illness quite prominently in it. So I am thinking that that's probably going to be sort of like one of my influences of my next sort of dark fairy tale. But the illness in this story is very much related just to like men, and it's male illness, and it's the king who's ill, and it falls to his sons to go and find the water of life that can save him. And in doing so, they like encounter the princess. And I just found it really interesting that you've got like the whole like starting point of the story is about saving the king and finding a cure for his illness. And I can't really think that would have happened if it was a female with an illness in it, because like the way it's just set up that the men are more powerful, they're more respected, and they're generally seen as more important. So yeah, in my next fairy tale, I do sort of like want to examine the female body and female illness and disability within it.
I love that. I feel like we're not seeing, I mean, definitely feminist fairy tales have gained traction, but I haven't seen very much that's dealing with body and disability. And I think that's very important for that to be a part of this world.
Yeah, definitely, because we do sort of like need to normalize like illness and disability. In the same way that like mental health needs normalizing as well. Like it will just get people talking about it more, and giving sort of like everyone characters that they can relate to as well is really important, I think. Yeah, so what writing advice would you give to others who are thinking of writing feminist fairy tales?
So if someone is interested in writing feminist fairy tales, I think the best thing to do is to read a lot of them. I personally think the best place to start is by reading the earlier versions, like we've talked so much about, whether it's Brothers Grimm, whether it's Hans Christian Andersen, Charles Perrault, whoever you find a connection to. I would read all of those earlier versions and start to pick out what you have issues with, what you find to be problematic. When I was in graduate school and I was reading The Bloody Chamber alongside the earliest English versions of the fairy tales we were studying, I said to the professor who was advising me, I loved this version until this happened. I don't remember specifically which story I was talking about. But her response was just so perfect. She said to me, if you don't like the ending or you don't like this aspect of it, write your own. And so that's my best advice. Start to read them from their earliest versions, then also look and see what is happening contemporarily in the feminist fairy tale genre. See what's out there, one, so you're not just rewriting what someone else has done, but also so that you can pick what you think you have to add to it, right? Because these stories are endlessly enduring, right? I think we're going to have fairy tales forever, and people always have some idea of a fairy tale. If you say that word, they can think of at least one. Even very small children. I've taught workshops to 6-year-olds, and they can pull up, oh, I think of Snow White. I think of this, So they're so ingrained in our society and in our culture, no matter where in the world we come from. So I think that they'll always exist. But I also think that, so that's important, to look at those, right, when you're interested in them, but also to see what you can add that is new to this canon that already exists, because everyone has their own perspective and their own experience. I say a lot with my writing and with She is the Beast, for instance, that I try to write from an experience that is as authentic to my own experience as possible. I write from a female-bodied experience. I write from the experience of someone who has experienced and survived trauma. I write through the experience of a heterosexual woman who has been in abusive and just bad relationships. I try to take all of my experience and take all of the issues that I feel are really important, like the right to choose what happens to your body, the right to have someone to share your story with if you experience trauma and you want to share your story. I try to create characters who are able to transcend their trauma or transcend their box that they've been placed into. Sometimes because I wish that I was braver or was able to live in a world where I could, slay dragons, if you will. But also, hey, you're back.
Yeah, my internet went, man, so random.
That's okay. But I also think that it's important to write from your own experience, and everyone has their own experience. So kind of to wrap up my little rant about if you want to write feminist fairy tales, read them, and then see what from your own experience you have to add to them. That's going to bring something fresh, and maybe, like we talked about, in terms of body and disability, bringing something to the fold that isn't already there, because we need to normalize all of these aspects, women's rights, women's bodies, disabilities, being transgender, sexuality and identity. These are all things that should be normalized. So what about you? What would be your suggestions if someone is interested in writing feminist fairy tales?
Yeah, I agree with you about sort of encouraging to read sort of like the earlier fairy tales and sort of the source materials for them, but also to be aware that because I think the fairy tale, like as a genre, evolved sort of like through the stories being told like orally rather than being written down. And I think that is quite interesting, sort of like examining how these stories could have changed a lot. And I think that is also why you end up with so many different versions of the stories, because obviously the ones that were recorded sort of by the Brothers Grimm, they're sort of like just preserving stories like as they heard them. And I think it's really interesting how it's sort of expected that fairy tales will sort of like evolve and change, and just sort of, yeah, comparing the different versions is so fascinating. And I think in that way it sort of like lends this sort of like extra sort of, it allows you to be more creative with them, because you can retell it in any way you want to. And I think it's important to retell it and sort of be inspired and let that inspire you to write what you actually want to write, rather than feeling that you've got to stick rigidly to like this overall template. Because there's just so much possibility with the different ways that you can write it, and you can just examine it from like so many different perspectives and so many different angles, and you can sort of like merge them together as well. And I think it's all about sort of writing something that you're really interested in and that really speaks to you as a person and as a writer, but also to have fun as well, because you're writing this sort of, like, I often find that when I'm writing anything at all, really, I'm doing it in a way to discover more about myself and to understand things better that are going on around me. So I think you shouldn't be sort of like too worried about making it really personal to yourself, because that is definitely for me when it speaks to me more, and I do find it fun as well, and I'm just really engaged by it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So like, should we talk a bit more about the sort of like how we actually go about drafting a
Sure.
story? Because I know that a lot of times when people ask me for writing advice relating to like a specific genre, they often like ask how you get started with a first draft. So like, how do you start with a first draft when you've just got like an idea and you know what you want to explore? Like, do you dive straight into a writing, or do you sort of like explore the idea a bit more from different angles first?
So I am someone who is like very organized in my everyday life. I have a calendar. I actually have multiple calendars. I have lists. Like I have a different to-do list for every day in different parts of my life. And in part of this is just that's my personality, and part of it is also I own a small business, and I have so much that's going on that I have to keep on top of what I have going on in order to just get everything done and be where I need to be when I need to be there. I mean, obviously things are a little different now during COVID-19, that my store is closed and I'm not doing all of that, but I still have a lot of responsibilities and things to take care of. I try to approach my writing from a completely opposite standpoint. So I'm very disorganized when it comes to my writing. I go with, what I'm inspired by. So sometimes it starts as simple as a concept. Sometimes I have a character in my mind. Sometimes I hear a conversation and I start there. I often don't know every piece of the story when I sit down. And so that can be a lot of fun, especially, exploring that character. My Cinderella reimagining, And She is a Beast, Husband by Midnight, is something that I had a general concept and then it just totally went off the rails. And it was so fun for me as a writer to not know where it was going and to keep pushing myself to get weirder with it. But sometimes I find that it actually really hinders me to not have a set plan. Because I can sit there stewing, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to end this? And I experienced that with the first story in the collection, Killing the Beast, my reimagining of Beauty and the Beast. I knew from the title, what was going to happen at the end, but I didn't know how she was going to kill him. I didn't know how we were going to get to that point. And I sat on that story for about 2 years. So sometimes it hinders me, but sometimes it allows the magic to happen. I feel like if I give myself too much structure with my creative projects, that it can make it not fun for me. It can take out the element of it that I enjoy so much, which is, having that aha moment with something when it just finally clicks together. Though there are sometimes stories where the whole thing just comes to me and I sit down and I write it very clearly. I will say, if you're trying to work on a larger project, that planning is important. I recently finished the first draft of a novel. And so for that, I have a bulletin board with Post-it notes for each chapter that I was making as I was going. But I felt that I needed to have some kind of structure or reminder for myself of like, where have I been and where am I going, just because it's so much larger. But I typically deal in short fiction, so it's not that hard to just flip back a couple of pages and, remind myself of where I've been. So what about you? What does your writing process look like?
Yeah, so, well, the main things that I write are actually novels, and my fairy tale, well, it's about 19,000 words, because of the winged white. And writing that was actually a very different experience for me than writing my novels. So I seem to be sort of like the opposite to you because when I'm writing novels, I don't plan at all. I just go straight in. But when I was writing this fairy tale of it being shorter fiction, I planned it extensively. So I did find the sort of writing process very different for the shorter piece. And I think I was like mainly really concerned about the structure because like I am sort of a novel writer and writing like this shorter piece was something that I did find really challenging. And yeah, so I remember when I was first coming up with like the idea for the Cast of a Winged Wire, I spent a long time reading like different source materials. And then I was just like writing out these long like synopses for it. And like one of my documents is like 8,000 words long, like outlining it all. And I remember thinking that I just felt like I had already written the story and I didn't feel as motivated to write it.
Mm.
And that's exactly like why I don't plan out my novels because I have to be like writing to discover what's going to happen to keep me interested. So I ended up with this really in-depth plan, and like I was calling sort of like this plan sort of like my draft zero, just because like I felt like I had already written a full draft, even though like it was really bad. But I just got so like caught up in the actual sort of like planning it and like the technicalities of it. But I just kind of realized it wasn't working for me. So then I thought, oh well, I'm gonna have to sort of like approach it in the same way that I would a novel. So then I restarted. I got rid of that whole plan that I'd written and just restarted completely. And then just sort of like took one aspect that I'd already planned out and then just built on that, taking it in an opposite direction. And then as I was writing, anytime when I then felt it had veered too close to either like the outline that I'd already written that I'd then discarded, or to something that just felt like it wasn't capturing sort of the spirit of what I wanted to write, I'd then like make it go in a complete opposite direction. And I do think that that helped me with the twists, sort of like towards the end of the book. But it did also mean that revising it and like all the editing was just such a nightmare because I just had so many like loose ends, so many continuity errors. And but I am really used to writing like that because I do all my novels like that mostly anyway. So yeah, I think well when I start writing my second fairy tale, I know now that I do need to approach it in the same way that I would write a much longer piece because I know that that is the sort of writing process that works for me. And trying to change it just because I thought, oh, that short fiction is going to be different, did turn out to be like quite a big mistake for me. So I think to any writers who are thinking of writing a fairy tale for like the first time, and if they're making it like shorter than something that they typically write, but they shouldn't sort of think of it as like a completely new type of fiction in a way because like especially with my own experiences, I found that I still needed like that sort of like discovery and the sensation that I was exploring alongside my main character as well. So yeah, you mentioned you've got a bookstore. So do you want to talk about that? Because I think it's so cool that you're a writer and you have your own bookstore.
Thank you. Yeah, so my husband Alex and I own a bookstore in Philadelphia called A Novel Idea on Passyunk, and we opened in December of 2018. So we're about a year and a half old, and we carry, all of the regular general kind of sections, but a focus of our store is supporting local writers, books about Philadelphia, and then small presses, which is actually how I met Jeremy from APEP Publications, who ended up making my book. We did a book launch with an author through his press. He and I got to talking, and 6 months later, I ended up sending him a manuscript. But it was really important to me as a writer when we were thinking about starting this store, that it would be a place that would support artists, because I'm an artist, but also I have so many friends, and there's so many amazing artists in the Philadelphia area, that I wanted to make sure that they're supported. So we are also an event space. Obviously, we're not currently offering physical events, but we are offering a slew of virtual events like book clubs. We do a monthly open mic. We have story time. We do a lot of workshops. A lot of them are either writing based or occult based workshops. And so we've been closed for about 2 months now, but we are hoping we'll be able to open in some capacity in the upcoming months. And in the meantime, if you're interested in checking us out, our website is novelideaphilly.com. You can also purchase my book through the website or through apeppublications.com. I think. Maddie, are you still there? Are we losing you again? I think we may have lost Maddie again. So I can tell you, I guess, a little bit more about the store while we wait for Maddie to get back on. So I already mentioned our website and some of our offerings. I will mention that during this time while we are closed, we are taking orders and we can ship anywhere. So if you are watching this or you watch this later and you're interested in buying books or notebooks or tarot decks, bookmarks, all of that kind of stuff, you can go to our website and we can order pretty much any books that are in print. If we don't have them in stock for you, you're back and we can have them shipped directly to you. Yeah, so I think I finished my spiel about the store, but I will say that it's something I haven't gotten to quite see happen because of COVID-19, but I'm excited about is since we carry my book, is to see my books on the shelf at my own bookstore. That is something that, was in the back of my head as like a future dream when we opened the store, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon. And I can't wait till we're actually, operating in the store again and I can see She is a Beast on a shelf. That'll be a really magical time. So I'm excited for that to happen when it's able to.
Yeah, I can imagine that would just be an amazing moment. So yeah, I think my internet is back now, but we should probably sort of like wrap up soon because I don't know why it keeps cutting out and it's probably going to do it again. So do you want to just finish by telling viewers where they can buy your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So She is a Beast is currently available in 2 places. You can order it through the publisher, which is apeppublications.com, or you can order it through my bookstore, A Novel Idea, at anovelideaphilly.com. So you can find it either of those places there, and we ship anywhere. So if you're not in the United States or the UK, we can still get it to you.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. My book, The Curse of a Winged Wight, is available pretty much any sort of like major online retailer. Bookstores, well, they're not really open now, are they? So I'll just mainly concentrate online at the moment. And it's available in paperback, hardcover, and ebook as well, I think. So
amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me, Christina. And I'm so sorry that my internet kept cutting out. So
that's okay. I feel like doing virtual. I mean, I'm so grateful and so glad that there are opportunities for virtual events during this time, especially in Philly when we're under a stay-at-home order. It's so nice to talk to other people. I love my husband very much, but it's nice to talk to people beside him and my dog. And something that going into these events is that you might lose internet, so don't apologize at all. It's been so lovely to actually see you face to face since we've emailed and we've messaged and we did book party chat, but it's so nice to actually to hear your voice and talk to you.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really like we're sort of like meeting face to face as well, but it's quite strange because like you say, that is just like the pandemic has sort of brought people together a lot online now in a way that probably might not have happened. So thank you to everyone who's watched this live with us. If you've got any questions, you can just post them into like a normal comment on the YouTube video and then we'll be able to reply later. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, this is just such a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much.